I think what we're going to do first, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be today, but to have a Mentimeter up, because together with the Bertelsmann Foundation or the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany, I run a big kind of platform to understand public opinion in Europe, and I would like you to answer a couple of questions. And one way I want you to do, and that was what was talked about before, I want you to prioritize when it comes to threats that are facing Europe today. So I would like to see what the answers are before. So that's failing to secure borders, being attacked by terrorists, falling victim to a large-scale cyber attack, being attacked by a foreign aggressor, being undermined by organized crime. Okay, so let's keep it here. You are not in sync with the Dutch population. The Dutch population thinks failing to secure our border, and actually they had an option then to say what that was, and it was migration was their #1 threat to the European Union today. So we're not in sync with the overall population. Next question. We have these threats. Do you think that the Netherlands in this case, or maybe you're from a different country, but let's shoot it from the Netherlands, can deal with that threat alone? Yes, my country can tackle these threats, so some of the things you saw before. No, my country needs support from other European countries. No, my country needs support from the European Union. We had to change slightly the more part cooperation in concert. Okay, well, you guys are definitely not in sync with the Dutch population. Imagine what the majority of Dutch people said. Yes, my country can tackle these questions by itself. I fell off the chair. Can I also say, of all 27 countries, it's the only country that said that, right? So, do you remember, the Brits are no longer in the European Union, but do you remember a very good British series or comedy series what's called Monty Python? And they had a skit about what has Rome ever done for us? Nothing. And then he said, well, maybe sanitation. Okay, maybe sanitation. Maybe roads. Okay, maybe the way to pay, a currency, etc., right? So the way that we think about the European Union, we need to prioritize about our threats, but we clearly all know we need to do that in concert, act in concert. But there seems to be, at least in the Dutch population, a degree of denial when it comes to that. And I think it can be illustrative of something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and that is that if you cooperate, you have to compromise. In one of the particular sessions that I was in, someone would say, how do we choose our losses? My response was, you don't choose your losses. Your cooperation partners or partners that you are negotiating with choose your losses, right? So that is, again, a little bit of a mentality that we're going to lose something. And I think it's illustrative of something that is very nice in Dutch. I feel very Dutch, especially when I'm outside of the Netherlands. But it's the idea of maakbaarheid. Right? So we can achieve things if we just efficiently come up with a plan. That's not the way how Italians think it works. The way they think it works is I go and sit together and see how, in the best way possible, I can get the best negotiation compromise out of this. They don't start with efficiency at all, right? So this is a time that the Dutch kind of idea of efficiency on a single market might have been very good for Europe. But the reality check is that it's not necessarily working in this way. So we're in a big shift, mind shift, someone said. The European Union was growing, and also the Netherlands in it, as a small open economy in a conducive triangle of forces. The first, relatively cheap energy coming from Russia, right? Primarily, not only. Second, a fairly okay operating rule-based system of cooperation in the world, which facilitates trade. Thirdly, a security umbrella, which was partly given to us, partly we relied on it, right, from the United States. However, this created the continent with economic security and prosperity and growth, but this conducive triangle has clearly unraveled. First, any provision was abruptly ended by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And also things like Nord Stream and things that the position has actually been also of this country to focus in on turned out to be a weaponization of a dependency, right? We've heard some of those things before. Secondly, the rule-based open trade system is undermined in two ways. Tariffs, coming from the United States. In Dutch, we will say this hot soup, we'll see how it's actually served in the end, right? We will see if the tariffs actually go through, but nonetheless. But the second one is the China shock 2.0, overproduction from China coming into Europe, right? It's coming from two sides. And then thirdly, the security umbrella is being challenged by the US to retreat from the world order. We've seen it in the security document that has come out over the weekend, where Russia is seen kind of as an ally and the European Union is seen as a foe, in the way, to just quote President Donald Trump, the European Union was set up to screw us. Gideon Rachman called this today in the FT the new clash of civilizations. So remember the clash of civilizations post 9/11, but this is now between the US and the EU. Well, maybe it's a little grandeur, but nonetheless. Interestingly, what we need to take from it is that there's a time of urgency, which we saw also on the Mentimeter responses. But to be honest, it's great to at least be one of those two civilizations. If we were so weak, if the model was so bad, why is Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth so concerned about it? Because it actually works. It's an alternative way of organizing power, of organizing sphere of influences, and doing it in a law-based, legal way in which you actually have something to say. Europe's problem is not policy recommendations. We have them two of the people I know quite well, Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta, who have developed a lot of policy programs. The same can go for a whole set of white papers, blue papers, coming out of the European Union. You have a lot of great people working here in your bank, some of the chief economists that we've heard of, at least Marieke Blom was in my session. There's a lot of ideas. The problem is not ideas or policy recommendations. The problem is fragmentation in the European Union, but especially a lack of urgency and a lack of political will. And I don't mean political will only by politicians. I mean that across the board, right? So are you willing to also forfeit? Are you willing to take the losses? Are you willing to forfeit some of the maximum outcome to do what we would call in economics a no regret? For example, to make sure that we can create a secure continent for us. The EU at this moment in time risks to be shaped by others rather than to shape itself. That is the key challenge that we're facing. And importantly, some people think that there's, maybe it's the, as I said, clash of civilizations or renewed Cold War. We have to be careful with these kind of terminologies. But that when China and the US are going at it, there could be a third power that comes up and then organizes trade, right? The problem is it really lacks the key understanding of what's happening. Actually, the rivalry between the US and China is because they're becoming more alike. They're becoming more alike because they're thinking about spheres of influence rather than rule-based negotiations or efficiency considerations. It's power trumps politics or rules. It's politics trumps economics in every way. And this, just the EU, by its sheer presence, as I said, is an alternative model that's going to be perceived adversarially by those two great powers, not just the US, also China. The problem in Europe is that European leaders are often reacting tactically, not strategically. So what we're doing is we're postponing the actual problem. We want to keep Trump in. We want to make sure that China gives us the things that we want, but not other things. But what we really need is a counter vision of what Europe is, what our red lines are, and what we're willing to forfeit in order to protect ourselves. Not just on the battlefield, not just in cyberspace, but also on our markets, in trade, etc. So is that then a way out of this, right? So we need to do it together, and we need to do it fairly soon, we've talked about. The problem, as I said, has often been this crippling fragmentation. But there are other ways in which we can go forward. And one of that is forms of flexible integration. We all know Schengen, right? Schengen did not develop as an EU policy. It happened outside of the treaties and was brought into the treaties by a couple of willing countries that wanted to open up their markets to each other in a full way, or treatment of people over borders. We could do that on different areas. We could do that in security. We could do that with the Capitals Markets Union. There are a whole lot of other things. If we can't get 27 around the board, we can do it in a smaller set. And the last thing I wanted to say is that this also means something for the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, and I'm saying that on the verge, I don't know what's going to happen at 5 o'clock today with a new coalition maybe, or some other parts of the negotiations, that we can no longer be the frugal accountant. This is going to be a very inefficient and messy time, and our freedom is not for free. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Super. So we have time for Q&A.
Yes.
Right. So I'm looking forward to that. Maybe I'll start out with a question, and maybe the audience says, "Oh, I want to do a question." But let me on that fragmentation part, right? What you said was Europe needs a strong story, and we need to. Stap over onze schaduw heen. Hè?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying, but I didn't find it. Right. So sometimes pleading for a more integrated Europe in the Netherlands is close to political suicide. So how do we get there? Because in logically, this is the way to go. But how do we?
Well, so I don't think the answer to all of this is an ever closer union at all.
Okay.
I think the answer to this is regaining effective sovereignty in areas where we don't have it. So if you basically want to create security, how does it make sense that the Dutch, not very existing army, is going to kind of defend our borders? It makes much more sense to do that with like-minded people. But the issue is not that Europe is the answer for everything. We have a lot of principles in the treaties that say things like subsidiarity, things that the EU could be done better at the regional level, do them at the regional level, do them at the national level. The problem in Europe, often what we do is, and I think that comes from, remember there was the Socialist Party calling Europe the super state, right? Biggest lie ever. If you look at the amount of administrative power of the EU out, it's really not the case. This idea that there's two options. The Netherlands being outside, or being basically Brexit Netherlands, or having a fully integrated, the EU is going to do everything federal state.
Right.
And there's way more in between of those two things.
But that needs nuance.
Absolutely.
And nuance doesn't work in politics.
No.
So how do we do this conundrum?
So I do think that you have to come up with a good slogan, and I think that slogan has to actually be, I think what you can learn from some of the, let's say, more populist politicians, is that they talk in relatively simple terms. So what do you need? You need a narrative.
Yeah.
The narrative has to have a hero, right? That hopefully will be the EU or someone like that, right? So, or maybe the prime minister or someone within the EU. It needs to have a villain, right? So what do? Maybe if we think that security is a big threat or tech companies a big threat, we have a couple of villains.
We have
right?
A whole couple of villains, yes.
Exactly. And then we would say, what do we need in order to get there? And I'm just saying that when you think about Donald Trump and how he sets up a narrative, for example, it is along these lines. And he's very good at entertainment. Berlusconi was very good at entertainment if you kind of look at how he did his strategy. But you could use that for much more, quote-unquote, progressive forces as well. So you have to have a narrative, it has to be clear, there has to be good people, there have to be bad people, there have to be a structure within that, and there has to be a goal. And I think that doesn't mean that the policy debates are that simple, but the political story has to be simple.
Right. So we need a positive populist or
I think the populists often say what you need, I think, to take from populists is there has to be an us, and there has to be a them.
Yeah.
Politics is about conflict. Conflict is about groups. Groups are about scarce resources. So you need to develop something where the Europeans are the us, and there is an other. And I can think of a couple of others.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of others as well. Great story. Okay, who wants to do a question? Yeah, we see some fans in the room. Let's go. If you would care to stand up, please. Introduce yourself and let's go.
Hi, Daan, the president of the Jonge Klimaatbeweging. And I was wondering, we see that a lot of policy debates in Europe have become a lot less technocratic and become more politicized. Is this a good or bad thing for a stronger Europe and our response to all the threats that are coming to us?
Yeah, so I have had a clear, this is of course, there cannot be a scientific right or wrong answer to that, right? It's kind of, that's about also partly a normative position or a qualitative judgment. I think that's very good. What we've seen for a long time is that the EU was very distant, Brussels was very far away, and we didn't know what it was about. Now it's about the knickers, i.e. there is something that's being discussed at the European level. And I think actually, if we're not able, as more pro, let's say pro integration, doesn't necessarily be pro-EU, you can think about different aspects. If we want to do certain things together and cooperate together, if we cannot tell that story in easy terms, we are the reason we're losing. Not because their story is better. There's very lack of alternative stories that are simple, that my family members who are not, thinking about politics all the time, but just about football, or if, Max Verstappen won or not, right? That they also need to be able, this needs to resonate to them.
Right.
So I think in that way, it's a good story. It's a good thing.
Okay, great one. Great question. Somebody else with a question. Nobody? No? Really? Oh, yeah, you. There you go. If you could stand up, we can see you all. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for that great presentation. I was wondering about how we are we have this pathological short-term vision that we work on. So we also address crises that are short-term. Everything is sort of short-term. And what we need are, of course, solutions that will be much more long-term. What mechanisms do you see around you, or what political mechanisms do you see that can actually support that good ancestor kind of behavior that we're looking for?
Absolutely.
Nice one. Thanks.
Absolutely. So two things to say about that. So one thing is that Europe, what it's often hampering is its complexity. It's very difficult to move the Titanic, right? There's a lot of checks and balances. Well, I'm very happy I live in Europe and not in the United States right now, where you have less checks and balances, which political science have been saying, because they're very politicized. So the complexity of Europe also protects us. It protects us against executive overreach that we're seeing in the US, right? But then the question of how do you get that machine to work in the kind of long element? And I think there, what was said before, you need to prioritize around a common core, have a couple of member states that move in that direction, have the Commission and the Council supporting them. That can be done. It can be done in the treaties, could even be done outside the treaties, bring it back in. And then basically you have to move forward. Oftentimes in Europe, what we have been able to do is to do something forward, and others want to join because they're I was talking to a Norwegian here in the room, there was again discussion in Norway, should it enter, yes or no, right? You have the discussions in Switzerland and Iceland. So I think we have to kind of move forward with a coalition of the willing and then see how far we go on key areas. But even that will require trade-offs.
Right. So final question is on strategic autonomy. I read an interview with Koen Teulings, a colleague of you, of course, and he said, well, strategic autonomy is a hype right now. It's a passing fad. We'll not hear about that what's your take on that?
Well, I don't remember who said it. I think it's a bit of a vague term. I think it was Marieke. It's a bit of a vague term. I don't really understand what it means. I think what I would say is that there are some, and that's maybe a little bit of an econ way of thinking about it, there's some no regrets, things you would do under any circumstances. Us developing some form of tech resilience and security resilience, i.e. security, both cyber and kind of physical, that seems a no regret. That's going to help us boost production that we need. We can unleash capital to do it. So you have some things that I think are just no regrets. The strategic autonomy starts to, could also sound like picking your winners. It could also be an entire industrial policy that comes around the corner. So I would say I would stick a bit away from that type of language, which is a little bit ambiguous, and make it more precise.
Right. Awesome. It was awesome to have you here on stage. Katrine de Vries, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't forget the earrings.
Thank you. Oh, yes, exactly. Thank you.